Hello, I'm Shari. I write as S.N.Arly, and today I'm going to be reading a few chapters from Something Familiar, my young adult novella that came out in spring of 2019. The sequel came out last year, right as the pandemic was starting, so it hasn't done quite as well as one would hope, but there's still time for that to do better. And there will eventually be a third book in the series. I am going to be reading starting at chapter 5. So if you're curious how the cat ended up where he is, you're going to have to buy the book. But it is available in digital and print versions. So, yeah, all right. Chapter 5. Oh, I got to put on my glasses. Can't see the pages. Haymal looked round his witch's room, surprised how comfortable he felt here. The walk up to the apartment above the shop felt oddly like coming home. It was bright and open, welcoming. Her room, with its light pink walls and high lofted bed in the corner, had a similar feel. She had some sort of craft space under the bed with a wall-mounted desk extending in both directions from the corner. A sewing machine sat at one end, with tidy folded pieces of fabric beside it. She had a computer and some textbooks on the other section of the desk. Until we can screen you for illnesses or go through the purification of a binding, you're going to need to stay up in my room, she explained, as if he could understand. A regular cat wouldn't, of course, and he wasn't sure how much of this was just Brigitte's way and how much was just her subconscious realizing that he wasn't an ordinary cat. He purred, butting his head against the bottom of her chin. Look, she said, carrying him toward her desk. You have your own special tree right here. She gestured to a floor-to-ceiling cat playhouse beside the desk, not far from the computer. The colors of carpet and fabric complemented the room and the curtains. He'd never gotten to play with cat toys or scratching posts. His father didn't believe in indulging his cat's eye. It looked new, but it smelt like it belonged here. He watched, attentive as she patted each level, pointing out the perches and nice things to rub against. This was clearly not some random pet store item purchased. This was clearly not some random item purchased at a pet supply store. It was either made to order or designed and made by his witch herself. The possibility that she'd put this kind of thought into her preparations for her familiar made his breath catch in awe. He wasn't merely an animal used to boost and focus her magic. And you have a nice kitty hammock. A net of pink denim, a perfect match for the pants from the other day, hung over the edge of the desk. I was thinking it might be a good place to nap while I do my homework. She leaned forward and encouraged him to climb onto one of the observation platforms. The carpeting was soft under his paws. He tentatively batted at one of the walls, engaging his claws briefly. They sank in and caught nicely, satisfying his urge to grab and yank things. He peeked into a large tube and saw a stuffed toy dangling from the ceiling. It made a sweet, soft jingling sound when he struck it. Oh, yeah, she said, watching him. We can switch the toys out if you don't like any of them, or if you just want to move them around. He glanced at her over his shoulder, then continued his investigation of the structure he was now certain she'd made. You enjoy yourself, she said, sounding pleased. I really want to spend some time with you, but I have to finish my schoolwork first. He heard her rummaging in her backpack. Physics was easy today, so I'll start there. While she worked her way through the day's assignments, he finished his exploration, eventually moving to the sling. It was quite comfortable, supporting his body while allowing him to droop in the boneless way cats could. He could already tell this would be the perfect spot to be near her while she studied. Every so often, she'd look up and smile at him, giving him gentle pats and praise each time. He could see this developing into a nice routine for them. You've been so good and patient, Brigitte said, reaching out to run a hand along his side. Just one class left, and it's not my best subject, so I hope you can bear with me. She'd started Mandarin last year. Part of her regretted not taking Italian or German like her friends Rahul and Alia. At least they shared the same alphabet as French, but when it was time to pick classes, Mandarin was a new option. Her mother had never pushed her to connect with her heritage, but she felt compelled. After all, Ruel spoke Arabic at home, and Aaliyah spoke Antillean Creole with her family. Pulling out a Hansa grid, she slowly and carefully drew her characters for the day, focusing on putting down each line and dot in order. Her handwriting was decent, but her pronunciation was hideous. She was best at differentiating the tones if people spoke slowly, but most of the time it was just a jumbled mess. 我是法国人, she said slowly, her finger under the characters on the page. While she was repeating this week's phrases for memorization, Heimao leaned over, gracefully spilling out of his hammock onto her desk. He padded over and looked down at the page. Ni hao, Heimao, she said happily. Do you speak Mandarin? In response, he reached out and pressed his paw on the page, dragging it away from her. She would have assumed he was bored and playing with it, but he'd turned the page to look at it right way up instead of sideways. His head tilted and he let out a long rolling meow. I know, she agreed. It's not very impressive, but it's only my second year. And I'm not the worst in the class. A low hum came from the back of his throat, like he was musing aloud. He reached out again and pulled her Hansa grid toward him. He tapped just off to one side. Oh, you like that one? She asked, grinning at him. You should. It means cat. He tapped it again, more firmly, and looked at her. Mao, she said. His tail swished gently as he stared at her for a moment. He tapped next to another character, the masculine form of you. Ni, she said, more puzzled. He returned to the phrase sheet and put both paws down on one sentence, only letting one character show between them. Sure, to be, you are, she translated. You are what? There was no way this was an accident. The stray cat she was hoping to become her familiar could read simplified Mandarin characters as easily as he seemed to understand French. Meh, he called to her attention, showing her the next character between his front paws. Wo, she said obediently. Ni shi wo, you are me? He let out a delicate sniff as he scanned the pages, finally settling on the possessive article that turned me to my. Once she'd said it, he wasted no time returning to the first character. Mao, she said, noticing that he'd sat down, clearly done. Ni shi wo de Mao, you are my cat. She spoke aloud as she translated, gasping as the meaning hit once the words were out of her mouth. He hadn't made it a question, but a statement. She clutched the front of her shirt over her heart. You're my cat? She asked, quietly, her eyes starting to sting. Really? He took a few steps closer so he could sit up and put his front paws on her shoulder. He rubbed his jaw along hers as if to clear up any confusion. Chapter 6. The apartment was quiet and Brigitte was peacefully asleep. She looked so calm and comfortable. Heimao reluctantly left the warmth of the bed, hopping down to her desk before relaxing and letting himself shift. He sat in silence for a moment, hoping the green flash of his transformation wasn't enough to wake her. His old clothes were snug, though they were still in good shape. He'd not had the chance to wear them out since he ran away. While he planned to primarily stay cat, he'd have to replace the clothes for times like this when he needed proper hands. Despite his limited socialization, he was fully aware that it would be creepy to sit around naked in a teenage girl's room, whether she was aware of him or not. But he could worry about clothes after he convinced her he was her familiar. He moved on silent bare feet to her desk and rummaged quickly for the supplies he needed. He'd seen everything earlier: scissors and note cards in the second drawer, colored pens and pencils in the canister beside her desk, rulers tucked into the center drawer. He pulled out her Chinese homework and started with this week's characters. Using his neatest handwriting, he wrote out flashcards, Hansa on one side and pinyin with the definition in French on the other. His wit was so clever. With the right tools, she was going to pick this up and do great. That's where he could help her. While he worked, he considered what it would mean to be Brigitte's familiar. His witch was the sweetest person on the planet. As Jacques Peranto, he'd met a good many people at photo shoots, galas, shows, pretty much any time his father wanted to parade him about. None of them were like her or her parents. They were so warm and kind. Even though her parents avoided touching him, they spoke about him and to him with more respect than anyone ever had, except maybe his mother. And they thought he was just a cat. Brigitte made sure he felt welcome and comfortable, even though she seemed unsure about keeping him. She was so considerate. He just needed to convince her because his mind had been made up before he'd first let her see him. Miss Gigi was right, and now that he was here, he understood better. This was where he belonged. Even if he never revealed his other side, he felt happier here than he'd ever been. He could be truly useful here. He'd also be protected from his father's magic, so it was a win for both of them. The bond was unbreakable. Even non-Witchborn knew that, and his father couldn't force him to go back, even if he were found. His new role would give him a purpose, something his life had always lacked. He nodded, refocusing his attention on the task at hand. He would do whatever he had to prove himself worthy of her, and once he had, he was determined to be the very best familiar in all of Paris. He could feel the approaching dawn by the time he finished up. He suspected her parents would be up soon, and he didn't want to risk getting caught like this. All his new plans would be out the window before his witch woke if that happened. He stacked the flashcards neatly on her desk, proud of his night's efforts. He'd managed to make flashcards for every week of the fall semester, plus much of the second semester from the previous year. It helped that she was so organized and kept everything where he could easily find it. He shifted back into cat form to return to the warmth of the bed. He was Haymau now. Brigitte woke to Haymau curled next to her head. She beamed at him. You weren't just a dream. She caressed him lightly, loath to disturb him if he was tired. She had no idea what the life of a stray was truly like, but she suspected it was exhausting. He purred in agreement, but didn't fully rouse. When she started gathering up her school things, she found a pile of homemade Mandarin flashcards, a perfect character on one side with a pinyin pronunciation and definition on the other. The tidy handwriting was completely unfamiliar to her. Yes, of course, she said quietly, both surprised and somehow not. If you can speak Mandarin, why wouldn't you be able to make beautiful flashcards overnight? He didn't respond. Her kitty was sound asleep on her pillow. Papa was at the table when she sat down to breakfast. Maman was downstairs running the shop and mixing up potions that needed morning attention, while Papa was between bread batches with the oven full. Haymau says he's my cat, she said, taking her seat. We saw him tell you that yesterday, her papa pointed out as he reached out for a croissant. That pawing and purring was cat for, you are my favorite person ever. Yeah, well, while I was doing my homework, he also told me in Mandarin. She pulled the flashcards out of her pocket and set them on the table. Your familiar speaks Mandarin? He glanced at her in surprise. She rocked her head from side to side. Well, he didn't speak it. He still has kitty vocal cords. But he pointed out the characters in order and then scent-marked me after I translated it. Her papa beamed at her. And you were afraid you wouldn't find a cat, that this one wouldn't want to stay. But isn't it a bit unusual? She asked. Could Callie read before your ceremony? He shook his head. No, but Callie was a regular cat, and while calicos are sought after, they don't have some of the innate abilities and magic their black kin have. He slathered his pastry with lingonberry jam. Can Callie write in French? Brigitte asked. She'd seen her parents' familiar read over their shoulders. Sometimes she pointed out notations and spells or recipes. No, her papa laughed. Cat paws aren't designed for that. Brigitte handed her papa the top flashcard. Haymau made these for me last night. The amusement faded, leaving awe in its place. Wow, that blows my expectations out of the water. He ran his index finger across the French translation, then handed it back. He must be exceptionally gifted, even for a black cat. Are you going to make it official? Nervously gnawing on her lip, Brigitte shook her head. He told you very clearly that he's yours, right? Papa asked, his voice gentle. She nodded. He's a smart cat, Cupcake. Given what you've learned and seen from him already, I can't see this as a mistake. He knows what he's getting into, and he's letting you know he's okay with it. He gently tugged one of her braids. With him as your familiar, you're going to be capable of so much. Don't let go of that opportunity just because he's different. I know you want to do this right, and I support that, but don't let uncertainty become an excuse. Chapter 7. Brigitte led her two best friends up the stairs to her room. With her hand on the door, she glanced back at Rahul. You sure Juniper will be okay with him? The boy grinned and reached up to pat the small red fox perched on his shoulder. She's awesome with regular cats, and even better with familiars. I don't think it'll be a problem. And if it is, she can go downstairs while we hang out. She's pals with Callie. She nodded and pushed the door open. Ni hao ma hei mao, she called. He'd woken up for pets when she'd been home for lunch, and he had seemed interested when she told him that Friday night was usually game night. You talk to him in Chinese? Aaliyah asked. Rue, do you talk to Juniper in Italian? Rahul laughed and shook his head. No, it hadn't even occurred to me to try. He followed the girls into the room. How did you find a multilingual familiar, Jeet? Luck? She suggested, peeking into the hidey holes of the cat tree. Where are you, kitty? A soft questioning meow came from her bed, but he wasn't peering over the side yet. He really likes my bed. She wandered over to the ladder. With as much as your pop says he likes you, that's not a surprise, Rahul said. It probably smells like you, so it keeps him company when you're gone. Hey there, sweetie, Brigitte said, smiling at the black cat sprawled on her pillow. We have company, and they'd like to meet you. She thought for a moment, working through the translation. 他们是我的朋友. They are my friends. Rahul laughed. Juniper came from Russia. Maybe I should try Duolingo for Russian and see if she still understands it. It was a Moroccan custom to pair witch children with their familiars young, so he'd been the first in the class at just over 11 to show up at school with a clingy new familiar. He was always the first to help each of their witch-born friends as they adjusted to their new bonds. Oh my God, Jeet! Aaliyah squealed as Haymau crawled into Brigitte's arms. He's adorable! She started to reach out but caught herself before she could be corrected. Sorry, still getting used to that. Aaliyah's family weren't witches. Brigitte and Rahul were her first magic friends when she moved to Paris from Martinique 8 months ago. Haymau stretched his neck to sniff the other girl, then the boy. His head tilted slightly as he took in the curious fox. He wiggled a bit, and when Brigitte loosened her hold, he climbed up onto her shoulder as if in imitation of Juniper. Jeet, Rahul said, puzzled as he stared at the cat. I thought you said you hadn't gone through the familiar ceremony yet. We haven't. She put one hand behind Haymau to keep him steady as she climbed down the ladder. Rahul snorted. You look claimed by each other. It's a little fainter than most familiar bonds, he clarified, but that's pretty common at first. He narrowed his eyes a moment and shook his head. Any prior claim you thought he had is completely gone. What does that mean? Aaliyah asked. Short story, that cat is definitely hers. No take-backsies, he explained. Long story, he probably has some magic of his own, and he's not waiting for her to choose him. He's made up his mind, and he's made himself her familiar. He squinted again. It's a little one-sided yet, probably because Jeet hasn't gone through the formalities. Later, the friends sat side by side on the chaise, which had been dragged over to Brigitte's computer desk. They'd already gone through Mario Kart, with Aaliyah surprising them all by being the overall victor for a change, and Brigitte couldn't bring herself to care. She's distracted by her kitty, Aaliyah insisted, pointing at Haymau, but I'll take it. Rahul laughed, his smile soft with reminiscence. Yeah, that happens to all of us. What does? Aaliyah asked. It's an adjustment to have a familiar, someone so connected to you. He reached out to catch Juniper's muzzle in a gentle caress. It's really nice, knowing you'll never be alone. I mean, you have to fuck up pretty badly for your familiar to snub you, and very few witchborn are willing to risk that. Does that mean her grades are going to slip? Aaliyah asked, frowning a little. Teachers at L'Etoile du Nord are pretty good about accommodating new witch and familiar pairs, Rahul said, glancing up for a moment before focusing on the racetrack again. You haven't really gotten to see it because most of us had ours before you moved here. Oh, but I've seen all the animals in class, Aaliyah pointed out. A full half of their class were witch-born, and a few others had different forms of magical power or abilities. How long does it take to get used to being connected to someone like that? It's usually a couple of weeks, Rahul assured her. Jeet will be back to usual form and beating us at video games soon. Jeet, Aaliyah said once she'd crossed yet another finish line in first place, I know you've been focused on your kitty, but did you see the update on the case with Jacques Peranto? Brigitte felt Heimau go still under her fingers. The famous model, son of her favorite designer, was right around their age. The consistently brilliant showings of the Peranto fashion house was part of what first sparked her interest in design. She religiously followed their trends and news, and had been about 10 when Pierre's wife vanished under mysterious circumstances. Normally, she'd be more invested in this particular case. She'd actually kept tabs on it since Jacques went missing from a photo shoot at Grand Palais in June. No, did they find him? Brigitte asked. Aaliyah shook her head. No, but apparently they've got some good leads. Pierre announced that he'd received solid evidence to suggest Jacques was fine, and he seemed convinced he'd be home soon. She tapped her chin with one finger. He didn't say if it was normal evidence, like photos or a letter, or if he was working with a psychic, but based on how he practically begged Jacques to come home, I'd guess he got intel that Jacques wasn't being held anywhere against his will. Heimau's tail lashed about, and Brigitte settled a hand on him to calm him. I hope he is really okay. I hate to think of all the awful things that could have happened to him. Aaliyah patted her back, careful not to brush against the fidgeting kitty. Remember what we talked about, Jeet. If the really horrible things had happened, there would have been a ransom demand. Brigitte nodded. I know, I think he's had a difficult life, and I worry. Heimau chose that moment to rest his head on top of hers, his little kitty motor vibrating against her scalp. She sighed, soothed by his actions. When they switched over to Skullgirls, the black cat let out a couple of excited chirps and wriggled on Brigitte's shoulder. You like this game, kitty? She asked. He leaned against her and hummed. Come here, she said, patting her lap. You can help me. You don't need help, Rahul said with a laugh. We don't even try to beat you anymore. We just aim for as high a score as possible. No, Aaliyah said eagerly. Let the cat help, she grinned. He might even things out a bit. Rahul nodded quickly. Yeah, please help Jeet out. Heimau, as much as you want. She needs it. Hey, Brigitte objected with a giggle. We're still new at being a team. No judging. We aren't judging, girl, Aaliyah insisted, her hands up in a warding off gesture. We're supporting your new relationship because that's what friends do. She ruined her serious statement with a laugh. Yeah, Rahul said what Aaliyah said. Brigitte settled her hand on the right side of the controller, her fingers hovering over the buttons. Wrapping her arm around Heimau, she used her left hand to pin the controller to her knee. She pointed to the big gray buttons. You're in charge of those, okay? The black cat butted his head against the bottom of her chin and reached out to place his left paw over the buttons. Do we get a warm-up round? Brigitte asked, looking up to find her friends staring at her with their eyes wide. What? Your cat plays video games? Aaliyah asked, stunned. Brigitte took in Heimau's gaze, intent on the monitor, his lithe body tense and ready to leap into action. No idea. I am no longer sure this was a good idea, Rahul muttered. Oh, how good can they really be at it? Aaliyah asked. They've never teamed up before, and it's not like normal teams where they each have their own controller. She snickered. I kind of want to see what would happen if we give Heimau his own controller. Rahul shook his head. Something tells me you're about to get schooled in the power of familiars, Aaliyah. He patted her shoulder. It's okay, though. I get to play the loser. So that's chapters 5 through 7 of Something Familiar. I hope you enjoyed it. And I hope you enjoy the rest of the convention.